Welcome to our thought session on trade and relations with the rest of the world. Listen as our thinkers discuss issues such as the future possible trading relationship with countries such as America and continents such as Africa, Asia and South America. Please sit back and think along these issues with us. So this week we're talking about trade and relations with regards to the rest of the world. The last session we had was on the European Union, so now we're going to branch it out and see what Britain's relationship can be like with the rest of the world post-Brexit. So I'm going to hand over to Tolua and ask her to talk us through the vision that she wants to put forward.
Okay, so I'm talking about trade and relations with the rest of the world, and sort of May has sort of made it her mission that Britain will be sort of what she called an outward-looking champion of global free trade, sort of post-Brexit. So they'll use this opportunity to enhance the UK's role on the world stage as sort of an advocate for global free trade rights, and so sort of looking to form partnerships with like Africa and Asia and parts of Latin America, sort of making trade the heart of its policy agenda, and specifically not aid but trade at its most free and fair, taking advantage of the 90% of global growth that's projected to occur beyond the borders of Europe. So I've sort of split it up regionally. So I'll start with South America. We're sort of looking at trade with Brazil in particular. So Minister Garnier, I don't know if he's still a minister because he's had a bit of a tough time recently. He visited Brasilia and was sort of having talks with firms about one in particular where they were going to establish a headquarters in London, and a UK-based laboratory was planning to export £11 million of pharmaceuticals to Brazil over the next few years. So that was sort of the beginnings of a relationship there, and he was talking more broadly that not only in Brazil but in South America in general, looking to establish sort of greater trade partnerships beyond building on those that they already have. So a lot of the rhetoric wasn't on forming new partnerships, it was on building relationships that already exist and are perhaps not as strong as the UK would like. Looking at Asia, there was a particular emphasis on India and...
Do you want to pause it there for a second?
Cool.
And then speak a bit more about trade within South America? So another important part touching on that is the relationship that Britain is building with Mexico. So they're investing, I think it's something like 30 million in Mexico's development, and that's going to be focusing on their energy sector specifically, and then other types of infrastructure that they want to build up. So do we see this involvement in the developing world as something that is positive, like considering Britain's history and the kind of relationships it's had with the developing world? Do we see it as something that can help Britain's economy, or is it sort of one-sided in the way that someone like Trump refers to trading with the developing world? How do we see it as something that can take the system forward?
I think it's really interesting what you said about emphasising trade and not aid. So it sort of changes the sort of discourses around the UK and like the Western world and these developing countries, and seeing them as more like our counterparts as opposed to these people that we're always trying to assist. Yeah. So it's good in that sense, and obviously it will assist the UK economy, but it will also, like if they're investing money into certain sectors, could have the really good effect of building those up. So
I also think that the point on existing relationships is quite important, because if you can't really talk about this question without Britain's history. And actually, when we talk about Britain's relationship now post-Brexit, you have to look at the way Theresa May's whole narrative has kind of shifted towards more on the Commonwealth and how she wants to reassert the Commonwealth ties. and you can see that in like right from her the beginning of her premiership. So you know, one of the things she did when she came in was call it the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, which I think are just these kind of small changes that really like shape what she wants. And when you talk about existing relationships, that's something we should include, that these existing relationships are based on Britain's imperial past, and actually they know that post Brexit and post Europe we can build on these relationships that were once quite profitable. And you know, India, like you say, Britain has always had quite strong economic ties with India, and that's something they want to move forward within the Commonwealth as a whole, not just India.
Yeah.
So I think maybe framing it around Commonwealth is quite a good way to like group those together, because it's not just India. Obviously, you've got Australia, you've got New Zealand, all around the world. You've got these kind of Commonwealth countries.
Yeah.
Okay, so today we spoke about Britain's relationship with the rest of the world in terms of trade. And one of the points that I made was that we need to focus more on Britain's history and in terms of their Commonwealth relations, as I think that's really important to understand both the rhetoric of the UK government both the rhetoric and their actions for the future in terms of where they want to focus trade as we move on from the European Union. One of the points that I made was about the Commonwealth being focused more by the UK government. So one of the small things being Theresa May creating the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, having a Commonwealth Minister, and really using Commonwealth more in her narrative and discourse. And I think that's quite telling of where she wants to focus our diplomatic efforts to get trade deals in the future, and really trying to flesh out these existing relationships and strengthening them as we move on from our European partners.
Because I was going to talk about using the Chinese model specifically in Africa, and how sort of whether it would work or not remains to be seen, considering the historical ties to the continent are very different for China than they are for the UK. You can sort of tell when ministers talk about these sort of building these trade links with thriving economies in the developing world, they're very, very careful about the terms that they use. So they're talking about building new and mutually beneficial partnerships, and they're very specific about making it clear that this is it's a relationship and it's a partnership, and it's not just sort of a one-sided deal. Exactly. They're being very, very careful about making sure that that's abundantly clear in every sort of word that they choose to use, which is smart of them. And whether or not that's how these relationships would manifest remains to be seen. And obviously, you can say one thing and do another. But I do think that I think that's quite interesting, the way they've chosen to frame a lot of their discussions on this. Yeah.
Is it really possible to really have a mutually beneficial relationship with a country that doesn't have the same amount of power as the UK? Surely, because the UK is a more powerful country, we're going to enforce some form of neocolonialism just because of that reason. Is that not a possibility, or can we still go along that route and be okay with whatever we come across with?
I think the investment in, like what Quarry said about Mexico's development, isn't so much neocolonialism, but it's kind of building up their infrastructure and what they could offer us so that they can become a trade partner for us, because obviously we're going to be lacking in that if the EU deal goes badly. So it's kind of an insurance thing, I guess, because you're investing in a country's development, which is good for them, but then that will cause trade for you, which is also good for you. So it's more of a mutually beneficial partnership.
I also would maybe question the idea of the UK being the stronger power, because I think that actually what you're seeing with these relationships of the future is Britain kind of having to rely on countries that it knows are stronger. You've got stronger economies, you've got countries with better infrastructure than the UK does, and actually I think that is pretty clear, and that we know we have to reach out to countries that are stronger. But you know, we might be stronger in terms of image and soft power, but actually I think that trade-wise it's very much a necessity, because we know that our economy, you know, the pound's the lowest, inflation is, you know, going the way it is and fluctuating, and we have to kind of look to options that are stronger. So maybe I'd question that. But
I agree with that.
So in terms of actually creating a vision for this, so if we were to advise someone and say these are the steps that we should take with regards to South America specifically, and we can make it broader, but South America specifically, what what kind of ideas should we be taking forward? What vision do you think would be effective going forward? So is it something we should definitely engage in, or should we look to ensure that the EU relationship is stronger, or
I think we have to kind of look elsewhere just in case, because we don't know how the deal's going to go. So the earlier we start creating ties with like places in South America, I think the better, because obviously we don't want to put all our eggs in one basket with, say, the EU, and then the deal goes badly. Are we looking last minute kind of for other ties before the economy plummets? So I think they should start getting on it now, looking for new markets elsewhere other than the EU, like just in case the deal doesn't go so well.
But I think South America specifically, there's kind of a diplomatic challenge there as well, because the moment we start focusing on Mexico, on South America specifically, we end up getting into a difficult relationship with America, because the way things are at the moment, I think that's something that potentially, when you're talking about South America instead of other parts of the world, that's something that I think the British government, and especially, you know, the government we have in power at the moment, might resist a little bit on that because of the possible implications in a diplomatic sense.
So you think so? And again, like it's important because there are sides, and you have to align yourself strategically. So do we think the relationship with the US is almost too lucrative to compromise?
Too strong, I would say. It's too much of an ally in terms of their strength, I think. And historically, again, when you bring in Britain's history, I guess we do need to look elsewhere, but putting our eggs in the right basket so we don't end up with more problems where our eggs might crash up together.
I think the US, though, I mean, obviously we can make the assumption that we'll continue to be strong trade partners and partners in virtually everything, but looking at the Trump administration with this like exclusively protectionist stance on world trade and relationships and this America First policy, whether or not trade is going to work in the same way if they do decide to close their borders to foreign trade and foreign investment, and do sort of look domestically to sustain themselves. Can we have the same relationship? I don't know.
So you're saying that there's a bit of a danger there?
It's not necessarily. It's more that we need to just see how true to his word Trump intends to be on putting America first in the most sort of like fundamental of senses, because there's putting America first, and then there's obviously closing your borders to foreign trade. Like those are two very different things, and I it remains to be seen, at least to me, where exactly he falls on that spectrum, because it's a lot of it's just been talk and not much action. So
he has mentioned though when the UK left the EU about how pleased he was about it, so that might be a bonus for us because he's gone and said that he's pleased about it. So he might do something about it and say, oh, trade with us instead.
And I think trade-wise, in terms of the US and Trump's America First policy, it's very selective in that he's not closing off trade, you know, for all of his flaws. He's not closing off trade to the world. He's being very selective in who he thinks deserves America's trade. So he's selectively pushing off the country that could ideally be his strongest competitor. You know, he's closing off a lot of his ties with China. He's closing off a lot of his ties with Mexico, arguably, as we're seeing already, like diplomatic-wise. Whereas I think the UK, he would, you know, I'm not sure if that's something he's looking at already. And Theresa May's rhetoric as well is very much, you know, banking on that America-Britain strong relationship going forward as we leave.
So I was talking about the potential for a sort of a greater and sort of more developed relationship for the UK with North America. So obviously we have strong linguistic and geographical and structural ties with the continent, and we already have fantastic trade relations with the US and Canada. But looking at the situation as it stands, and the Trump administration's sort of focus on protectionism in relation to trade, and President Trump's sort of America First policy, whether it would still be feasible to expand that relationship, whether in fact the US is looking to close its borders to trade in general, how we maneuver that, and whether it's worth investing time and effort into a relationship that the US doesn't necessarily see for itself in the sort of as it stands right now. Okay, so looking at Africa specifically, I sort of looked at the relationship. I think the model that I was looking at and why it even came to mind was China's relationship with Africa. So China is made a big. So now they're the biggest trading partner with the entire continent, and they've really made the most of their historic ties to Africa. So obviously, China's socialism is in part what sort of inspired a lot of African independence movements, and that coming later to how Britain is supposed to emulate that, I think that might be quite a big difference, and that might have quite a big impact on how effectively they're able to establish these relationships, because their histories are totally different. One is incredibly positive and one is obviously horrific, but they're also China's major import source is Africa as well, and it's fourth largest investment destination, and there's definitely sort of a bilateral relationship there. It's very much sort of, I don't want to say quid pro quo, English please, okay, but you know, they get resources from Africa, and Africa obviously gets investment in infrastructure and railways in some parts of the continent, and I'm not saying that Britain needs to start building railways in Africa, but I definitely think that's a model, and again, I think a difference may lie in the fact that when China did it was very much novel, and it was unexplored territory in that respect, and what they did was incredibly innovative, and if the UK were to copy that, that would be copying it. It wouldn't perhaps be as effective as it was for China, but I definitely think there is something there, especially considering that Britain is looking to be this sort of outward facing global economy that's like looking to other parts of the world, and looking to build relationships in places that it necessarily hasn't always had positive relationships or hasn't had relationships at all. So I definitely think that is something that should be looked at going forward.
I think that's a really important point, because it's not necessarily looking at what China did in Africa and trying to copy it, but looking at its mould and then applying it to what Britain can offer. And so while China was able to offer help with infrastructure because it has a big population and it could actually physically go out and build things, Britain's strength, as we were saying before, is in services, and so it can be in helping Africa develop its services industry. And so creating new financial centres in big cities like Accra or Nairobi or Cape Town, and of course there are financial centres there already, but developing them further. So what do we think of that as a sort of vision for going forward?
I think you've got to tread carefully with policy in Africa, because obviously you mentioned the different history to China, so it's quite easy to forge relationships with China when there's not this kind of resentment there for what happened before. So I think when formulating like trade policy with Africa, you have to be very careful, because obviously the atrocities that they did before, like you've got to make sure that when you're formulating policy is really beneficial, not just for Britain but for Africa as well, because doing some justice for what's been done is really important.
Yeah, I agree with that.
There has also been some debates around foreign influence in Africa, and how like some like oil companies, you know, are playing themselves off against each other, and they're playing domestic companies against each other, which could have detrimental effects, especially if there is that history of, you know, that colonial history of, you know, these people are coming into our country and taking whatever. I mean, even with the Chinese model as well, of course China has loads of benefits, but there is in some places in Africa some resentment towards the amount of Chinese that are coming into the country and, you know, setting up businesses, and how they're effectively taken over. So in that sense, I think like a balance needs to be created to sort of benefit Britain and also put the countries first as well.
I think that's an important point, because actually thinking from my perspective and the people that I speak to who work in Africa, like certain countries in Africa, the resentment is more towards the Chinese than it is to the British. I don't know if that's like, you know that from your experience of working with people there as well, but definitely because China's presence is physically there at the moment, there is a lot of resentment because of the misuse of resources that's been taking place at the moment. And while they have helped in terms of developing infrastructure, they've taken a lot as well. And it's possibly because their their crimes are more recent, that they're actually seen as more the bad guy than the British. So yeah, that could influence where.
So then, going forward and making trade deals with Africa, then does that mean that we're going to be able to stop that from happening with the UK and going into Africa, or is it just going to be the same thing? Are we going to just impose ourselves in the same respect that the Chinese have done at the moment, or are we able to, prevent that from happening?
I think maybe there should be a focus on like building up African industry and like investing in African companies to trade with, rather than Britain coming over and sticking our companies there and acting as competition for them.
I think that's the intention. I think that was at least perhaps initially the Chinese intention in looking at Britain's relationship with Africa. It's more about sort of building on parts of aspects of trade agreements that exist already that are working well. So it's not about like coming in, and I think this might sort of be a way around this problem. It's not about coming in and imposing new sort of a new kind of relationship. It's building on relationships that already exist, and specifically parts of the relationship that are working well. And I think it's less about doing anything new or novel, and it's more about Britain itself paying more attention to Africa. So obviously we already pay attention, and we already have sort of a relationship with the continent, but it's more about taking whatever sort of focus you had on Europe because you were part of the European Union and projecting that elsewhere. And so it's just making sure that you use the relationships that you have to sort of a greater extent than you do at the moment, perhaps previously because your focus was elsewhere and you were part of this massive trading bloc, and relationships with Africa and South America and Asia weren't your priority because you were getting everything that you needed from Europe.
Yeah.
I think
if we were to do deals with Africa, then development needs to be at the basis of it. It needs to be something that's going to develop that country, that continent further than just to say that, we could use it as a mutually beneficial thing. I think it needs to be more beneficial for the countries prior to being beneficial to the UK, especially in Africa and in the more less economically developed countries.
Yeah, because that's the only way you're going to get anywhere, if you're offering someone something that's really good, so that they're like very pleased with it, so that they trade with you, not because they feel like they have to, but because they actually want to. But at the same time, you don't want to make anyone feel indebted to you, so there is a line. But
then does that, in saying that, what's the difference between that and indirect rule and colonialism as we saw all those years ago?
So I think what's important to realise as well is that countries in Africa aren't sort of all in the same position. So there's a lot of diversity in terms of their levels of development. So they're not necessarily in the position to be imposed upon the way that they were before. And so there are industries already established, there is infrastructure already established, there are services already established, and it's about forging partnerships with them to further strengthen them. And when we speak about like Britain doing trade with Africa as a continent, I think it's too broad. But then I do think that we can touch on that and use it. And so one idea that I had was Britain using its experience from the European Union and helping to develop the African Union. And so the African Union is an organisation set up, and it hasn't actually been super effective so far.
doesn't do anything.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Smaller regional ones are more of it, so like ECOWAS.
Yes, yeah. So it could be an idea that Britain could use its experience from the European Union and help it to develop the African Union, which would then allow it to do trade with the continent more generally than to deal with individual countries. And do we think that that's
I think that's a really good way of sort of correcting the power imbalance, because inevitably there is a power imbalance, especially with the history, etc. So obviously you need to take a more tailored approach to each individual country, because Africa is huge, and like you said, different services are developing at different rates, etc. So in that sense, it's sort of like helping Africa to help itself, and through that the power imbalance is sort of reduced, because through that they're helping themselves, and it's not like we're going in there and they're now indebted to us because we're investing in them, etc. But they've built themselves up, and we've, you know, helped them, you know, giving them the expertise to do that, and from then on sort of building those trade relations, etc.
And definitely focus on different strategies for like how developed the countries are, because like in the less developed countries, focus more on building them up and making them more developed. In the more developed countries, focus on using their industry and our industry and thinking what mutual benefits can we get out of this. So really providing different strategies for kind of different stage of development the countries are in is important.
And I think even if Britain isn't the ones to go and enact that development, by strengthening the African Union, it can help the more developed countries in Africa to help the less developed countries in Africa. And so if you look at the European Union is arguably just as diverse in terms of development as Africa. A country like Serbia is nowhere near a country like France or Germany in terms of development and infrastructure and how sustainable their economy is. So, but then the European Union works because a country like Germany can help Greece, for example, when their economy goes bust. And so if the African Union is strengthened to that point, then it can be that union which is strong enough to help and build itself up, and then Britain can trade with that union as a bigger bloc. And it touches on what you were saying about the power imbalance, because there's more power in Africa as a united sort of bloc than there is as individual countries.
Trying to say that do we not see the paradox? I mean, just on the side point, the paradox of us leaving the EU, and we're trying to then take that infrastructure and build it in a different place and try and help a country do exactly what the EU is meant to be doing.
Yeah.
That is very true.
But you could just say, oh, it could work for them, but it didn't work so much for us.
I don't think we're taking the entire EU.
Of course.
Obviously, a huge part of the reason we left was immigration. I don't think we're gonna. I mean, immigration at least in sub-Saharan Africa. I can't speak for North Africa because I don't really know much about it. But sub-Saharan Africa, borders are relatively fluid, so that wouldn't be something that probably even came into the conversation. And we'd be looking only at sort of the economic aspect of certain parts of that relationship.
So during the thought session, I was speaking about the African Union and the potential for Britain to take what it learned from being part of the European Union and using that to develop the African Union. I think this is a good idea because for Britain to trade with a bigger bloc is more beneficial for both sides. It gives the African nations more bargaining power when negotiating with Britain, and it gives Britain a bigger market to tap into more easily, as opposed to having to make deals with specific countries.
So I'm looking at Europe, but sort of the countries sort of on the fringe of Europe that aren't in the European Union. Looking at, for example, Turkey and some of the Central European countries that haven't yet joined, and they have sort of they have strong growth potential. So as long as they remain stable, which again isn't yes, but as long as they remain stable, that could be an opportunity closer to home as well. So just in terms of the functionality of that relationship, it's obviously much easier than liaising with South America. We've obviously spoken about the US briefly already, but not even just the US, North America in general. The opportunities available there are huge, and currently over 20% of UK exports of goods and services already go to the United States and Canada. And obviously just from sort of similarities in geography and language and strong historical ties like Nikita mentioned earlier, and there's a lot of opportunities to develop relationships there. Trump's protectionism could pose a problem, but again, that's sort of more in the long term, seeing how that plays out. But the US has made clear that they're very, very excited to work with the post-Brexit Britain. So,
and just on the US, so there's a lot of political capital that can be lost by having close ties with Donald Trump. But do you think it's worth? America's obviously bigger than Trump. The presidency is going to last longer than Trump's term or terms. So is it worth establishing those strong relationships from now, knowing that Trump is only temporary, or does it still do a lot of damage?
I think it's going to be difficult to establish a strong relationship with him, given that whenever he says he's going to come to state visit here, people get up in arms and arrange a protest. So it's going to be very difficult. So maybe place less emphasis on we're working with Trump as a leader, rather and more on we're working with America and what America can do for us.
Yeah, no, that's definitely. I haven't listened to every single speech by every member of Theresa May's cabinet, but I have yet to hear anyone say, "Oh, we're excited for a relationship with President Trump." It's more we're excited to continue our long-standing relationship with the United States. We obviously have a very strong military and historical ties, and will remain close. And remaining close has also been very much central to the discourse. So I think people are aware that placing their bets on the Trump presidency is a dangerous thing to do. And I think exactly if we look beyond, fingers crossed he doesn't even make it to the end of his term.
That's true. I was going to say you don't know what's going to happen. He could get impeached in the next year.
So I think it's definitely worth continuing. Absolutely, and because there've been presidents people have disliked prior to Trump, and there'll be plenty afterwards. So it's definitely worth continuing that relationship. Just being very, very careful about the terms that you use discussing a relationship with the US and not with a specific administration, regardless of whether you like that, even if it was a president that people generally liked, you'd like still be careful to talk about a national relationship as opposed to like a personal one.